All right, all right. Thank you for joining me in this episode of the Gospel of Truth. I'm your host, Marlon Wilson, and we have another exciting one for you today. I have Dr. James Anderson with me from Reformed Theological Seminary, and we're going to be talking about is atheism intellectual suicide. Of course, the Christian community believes that it is, and it's probably right that the atheist believes that it is too. Practically, right? Or that's the logical conclusion that atheism is intellectual suicide. I'm very excited about this because I've been watching some Dr. James Anderson, and he's very thorough, and he's clean, man. He's one of the cleaner apologists that I've seen. He's very thorough with his argument, and he progresses through his argument very, very systematically and very clean, if a lack of a better term I could think of. But I just want to thank you for joining me on this episode of the Gospel Truth. And, as always, I do want to go ahead and encourage you to like and follow the Gospel Truth. I want you to go and subscribe on YouTube. Make sure you hit that notification bell there. And when you're on Facebook, make sure you hit that like button, give me that thumbs up, and go ahead and hit that notification bell for the Gospel Truth page as well. As you know, this content is on podcast. Just a reminder out there for anybody who don't know, just a first note there that all this content is on podcast. So go ahead, flow over to iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, Spotify, and go ahead and subscribe there as well. If you're just one of those individuals that just like to listen to audio, and you can be on the go listen to some debates or interviews that are on the Gospel Truth. And I also want to go ahead and give you some announcements that are coming up, some upcoming shows coming up. May 30th at 6 p.m. Pacific Standard Time, I have Vocab Malone and Adam Coleman coming on, and we'll be discussing Black Hebrew Israelites and their failed theology. So this will be an exciting show. I'm a big fan of Vocab Malone, big fan of Adam Coleman, and they do great things for the body of Christ in the urban apologetic community. So I'm very excited to get these guys on. After that, I have a great debate coming up. Mr. Tyler Vila, who is going to be debating Will Duffy. Does the Bible teach that God knows the future? That's coming up June 5th, 2020 at 6 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. After that, I have my man Eli Ayala, and he'll be debating Andrew Rogers. Yes, and he's an atheist. Is there evidence for the God of the Bible? That's coming up June 6th at 4 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. And then lastly, the Gospel Truth's first 2-on-2 debate. This is the first tag team debate, and it'll be Trinitarian versus Unitarians, and is Jesus the God of the Bible? That's coming up June 9th at 6 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. That is just the next 4 shows that are coming up on the Gospel Truth. Once again, subscribe, like, hit the notification bell, do everything you can to stay in the loop with what the Gospel Truth has going on, and so you can hear some debates, man. There's an entertainment value to the debates, but there's also an educational value, which I desire to put out there is the more educational aspect of it. But it's out there, and I want you to be included. So make sure you do not forget to hit the subscribe and the like button. With that said, I do have Dr. James Anderson with me, and he is an ordained minister in the Associate Reformed Presbyterian Church. Dr. Anderson came to Reformed Theological Seminary from Edinburgh, Scotland, and specializes in philosophical theology, religious epistemology, and Christian apologetics. His doctoral thesis at the University of Edinburgh explored the paradoxical nature of certain Christian doctrines and the implications for the rationality of the Christian faith. His research and writing has also focused on presuppositionalism of Cornelius Van Til, particularly his advocacy for the transcendental argument. Dr. Anderson is a long-standing concern is to bring Reformed theological tradition into greater dialogue with contemporary analytic philosophy. Before studying philosophy, Dr. Anderson also earned a PhD in computer simulation from the University of Edinburgh. He is a member of the Society of Christian Philosophers, the British Society for the Philosophy of Religion, and Evangelical Philosophical Society. Prior to joining Reformed Theological Seminary, Charlotte, Dr. Anderson served as an assistant pastor at the historic Charlotte Chapel in Edinburgh, where he engaged in regular preaching, teaching, and pastoral ministry. He is married to Catriona, I believe I pronounced that right, and they have 3 kids. So let me bring Dr. Anderson in and thank you for joining me. How's it going, Doctor? How you doing?
I'm doing fine, thanks, Marlon.
All right, thank you for joining me on this episode of Gospel Truth. As you know, as I already said, I was really excited about this episode because it's hard pressed sometimes to get the guys in the academic realm to come on these type of shows because of the business of you guys' schedule. So it's very, very exciting to have you on. And another note is that a lot of times professors from the presuppositional position, they don't get a lot of airtime. Typically, the evidential apologists get a lot of airtime, and I really feel that the presuppositional position has a lot of ground and should be seen and should be heard and should be known. And that's why I wanted to call you. Emailed you and wanted to get you on. So I want to thank you for joining me, Doctor. Appreciate you, man.
You're welcome. You're welcome.
All right. So it is known that you're a huge Cornelius Van Til fan. And what is this rumor that I hear about you having a mug saying that Cornelius Van Til is your homeboy? What's that all about?
It's more than a rumor. It's sober fact. Yeah, I have a coffee mug. In fact, lo and behold, look, here it is. It's right here. There we go. There we go. Yeah, I don't use it as much as I used to because it doesn't hold enough coffee. I've got to the point in life where I need to have a massive cup of coffee, so it's more for decorative purposes now. But that was given to me as a gift years ago. I can't remember exactly who it was who gave me it, but I'm very proud of it.
Cool, man. That's good stuff right there, man. So why don't you start by just giving my audience a little rundown of where you come from, what's your background a little bit. I know I read your biography, but I just give a little maybe a little personal background. How did you come to Christ? What was what was it? What happened in your salvation? Something of that nature. Then, what drew you to, instead of going with evidential apologetics, what drew you more closer to the presuppositional side of apologetics?
Sure. Well, I was raised in a Christian home, thanks to God. I appreciate the fact that my parents were believers. They raised me to be a believer, to go to church. So I don't recall a time when I didn't believe in God, didn't believe in the great truths of the gospel. But it was more an intellectual affirmation of it, and there really wasn't a personal heart commitment to it until I reached my teenage years. And I went to a summer camp where I was really challenged about that personal commitment to Christ, and particularly the verse Luke 11:23, where the Lord Jesus says, he who is not with me is against me, and he who does not gather with me scatters. And I realize there's no middle way here. Either you are for Christ or you're against Christ. Either you're with Christ, fully committed, or you're not. And I wasn't sure at that point that I really was committed. So it was at that time when I realized, yeah, I know what side I want to be on. I know what I want to commit my life to. And that's not to say there weren't ups and downs since then. Of course, that's very often the case, but that was a real turning point in my relationship with the Lord. Now, I went to university in Edinburgh to do engineering, but became very interested in Christian apologetics, mainly because once I graduated, I was working in a research department where there were a lot of very smart unbelievers, some who were actually many, I guess, who were atheists, and we often got into conversations about the existence of God, the nature of the universe, and so forth. And I wanted to have good answers to these questions, so I started doing a lot of research in Christian apologetics and started off with the sort of standard evidentialist fare, Josh McDowell material, Norman Geisler's classical apologetics. But it was around about that time that I started getting into thinking more self-consciously about my theology, and came across Reformed theology and became persuaded of the core tenets of Reformed theology. And that introduced me to the world of presuppositionalism, in the sense that often those who are committed to Reformed theology and interested in apologetics are familiar with presuppositionalism. And so I started looking into what is this debate. I'd never encountered this debate before between evidentialists and classical apologists and presuppositionalists, and was intrigued by it. But really it was reading John Frame's book Apologetics to the Glory of God that brought about a kind of a light bulb moment, a sort of paradigm shift in my understanding of apologetics and how we should go about apologetics. So it was really first coming to Reformed theology and then thinking about some of the implications of Reformed theology for method in apologetics that led me into the camp of, I guess, what you'd call Van Tillian presuppositionalism.
Okay, nice. I mean, that's a great transition. It's almost like just a systematic flow with the transition to getting to that point of presuppositional apologetics. And so obviously this debate is about, is atheism intellectual suicide? So as I told you before, I wanted to go through your argument about the laws of logic, the necessary truths of the laws of logic, and how our propositions are either necessary or truths or false, but they cannot contradict the laws of logic. So I want to go into that, and then I want to progress into how that equates to intellectual atheism as intellectual suicide. So I mean, my first question is, so it would be like, how can I explain it? So the laws of logic are, laws of non-contradiction, law of excluded middle, and what was the final one? The law of identity. Sorry. So how do you place those laws as far as propositions are concerned? What is the argument there? What is the formulation of that argument?
Sure. Well, maybe to back up a little bit, just to give some context. So a number of years ago, I co-authored an article entitled "The Lord of Non-Contradiction," which set forth an argument that the laws of logic require the existence of God, and this is a fairly typical claim of presuppositionalists, that rationality, that logic, that science presuppose the existence of God. But I wanted to put at least part of that into a more formal argument. So what exactly are we saying when we say that the laws of logic presuppose the existence of God? So this was put into an article that was published, I think, 2010, and it starts off in the way that you've just described by just saying some basic things about the laws of logic. So if you get a book on Introduction to Logic, then it's going to tell you about some basic laws of logic. The law of non-contradiction, that no statement can be both true and false. The law of excluded middle, that a statement is either going to be true or false. The conjunction of a statement and its negation will always be true, because one, it has to be true or false. And the law of identity is simply that if a statement is true, then it's true. I mean, it's a real trivial truth, pretty much. So that's the starting point, to recognize that the laws of logic themselves are truths. They are true propositions. When we say, for example, that no statement can be both true and false, that's the law of non-contradiction. No statement can be both true and false at the same time and in the same sense. Then that's a law, and it's a true law. The laws of logic themselves are truths. So what's interesting about the laws of logic is they are truths about truths. They're truths about the necessary relationships between truths in general. And that's sort of the starting point for the argument, to observe that the laws of logic themselves are truths. And then we can ask more questions about what is the nature of the laws of logic and see how they imply the existence of God.
All right. So in your article, you have 8 arguments, right? You have the law of logical logic really exists. The laws of logic necessarily exist. The laws of logic are non-physical. The laws of logic are thoughts. The laws of logic are divine thoughts. And I think I sort of got those screwed up backwards a little bit. But the laws of logic are truths, and the laws of logic are necessary truths. I think I got them all. Is that correct?
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah. So it's one argument, but there's 8 stages to it. That's maybe the best way to put it, to recognize that we proceed in the argument step by step, trying to lead the reader to understand certain things about the laws of logic. So the first step is the one that we've just talked about. In fact, the first 2 steps: first, that the laws of logic are truths, which is simply to say that they are true propositions. A proposition is just something that can be true or false. So the laws of logic are truths. That's step one. Step two is that the laws of logic are truths about truths, as I said a moment ago. And then the third stage is to recognize that the laws of logic are necessary truths, which means that not only are they true, they could not have been false. It's impossible for the laws of logic to be false. They are necessarily true. So that philosophers generally draw a distinction between necessary truths and contingent truths. So a contingent truth would be that James Anderson exists. That's a truth. Here I am, okay? But I didn't have to exist. It's not necessary that James Anderson exists. So that's not a necessary truth. It's a contingent truth. But a truth like the law of non-contradiction, that no proposition can be both true and false, that's a necessary truth. And there are many kinds of necessary truths, but the laws of logic are a pretty good example of necessary truths. So those are the first three stages, and they are pretty uncontroversial. I mean, there are some philosophers who dispute the notion of truth and the idea of necessary truths, but I think most philosophers would be willing to grant the first three stages there.
All right. So in your conversation with Tom Junk, I watched that and I appreciated your candor. I appreciated your grace towards him. It seemed that you were growing a little bit frustrated in a sense, like, man, because I know you said that you want to progress to further in the logical steps of the laws of logic, to get to certain aspects that probably present stronger arguments. It seemed that you guys got stuck on, I think, the laws of logic are necessary truths. I believe you guys got pinpointed there, and that's where you spent most of your interview at. Am I correct there?
Actually, I think we agreed on that, or at least I don't recall us having a disagreement about that. It's the next step, which is stage four, yes. That the laws of logic really exist. That's where we ended up going round and round and round, because I hope I didn't come across as too frustrated, but the issue was that we were trying to pin down what kinds of things are the laws of logic, and do they exist in the sense that they have a reality in the way that physical things really exist. Obviously, the laws of logic aren't physical things, but we can talk about abstract things that exist as well. And I was trying to pin Tom down on what his position was with regard to propositions in general. So propositions are things that are true, they are truths. Of course, there are false propositions as well as true propositions, but we're focusing on the laws of logic. So we're focusing on certain category of true propositions. And it seemed to me, at least this was my take from the conversation, that Tom didn't have a consistent position on what propositions were and whether they exist. At some points, he seemed to be saying, yes, they exist, but they're thoughts or they're concepts. At other times, he seemed to be saying, well, no, they're sort of a useful fiction. We have an idea of truths, but truths themselves don't exist. And we never actually resolved that, which is a shame, because then we would have got on to, I think, the more interesting parts of the argument about why, if there are necessary truths, there has to be a God to account for these necessary truths.
So aren't there like four, or I think there's like 3 or 4 arguments that try to argue against the does logic really exist? I think one of them is simple from linguistics or ordinary language. Is that correct?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so actually in the article, we offer more than one argument for the existence of the laws of logic. And one is just an argument from ordinary language. That is, when we make statements like there are such and such. So if I say there are penguins, that ordinarily implies that penguins exist. If I say there are colors, okay, again, on the face of it, that implies that colors exist. And it seems natural to say there are laws of logic. I mean, if there aren't laws of logic, then why are we worried about them? What are we doing when we argue if we're not trying to follow the laws of logic? So if someone says that there are laws of logic, and here are some examples, the law of non-contradiction, the law of excluded middle, law of identity, that implies on the face of it that there there really are laws of logic. The laws of logic are things that exist. And unless we have good reason to think that we're speaking figuratively, metaphorically, something like that, then on the face of it, that commits us to the existence of the laws of logic. But that's just one argument. And there are others that are actually a little more technical and sophisticated.
Yeah, I think I found the second argument, an appeal to the ontological intuitions, or to our basic ontological intuitions. I found that one pretty interesting. Do you mind diving into that one a little bit?
Yeah, that one's fairly simple to state as well. So ontological has to do with things that exist, things that have being, and intuitions are things that we sort of take for granted or seem quite commonsensical to us. And I think a fairly commonsensical principle is that only existent things can really make a difference in our lives. Okay, things that do not exist can't impact us. They can't really, they don't really make any difference to our everyday lives. Only existent things can make a difference, a real difference to our lives. But of course, the laws of logic make a difference. The laws of logic are really important to us. Our thoughts are subject to them. So if someone violates the laws of logic, we think that's a big deal. That's something to be call them out on. So we take the laws of logic seriously as things that make a difference. They make a difference to how we judge people's thoughts. And if that's the case, then the laws of logic must exist. If only existent things can make a difference in our lives, and the laws of logic do make a difference, then the laws of logic exist. So that's the second kind of argument.
So what would you say to someone, an atheist, that would say that, well, laws of logic are just are only true or only relevant when we actually use synthesis, or when we make a proposition, when we use language to make a proposition? Like, how would you argue? What would be your comeback on that one? That propositions aren't necessarily, I guess, necessarily something non-physical, and they become physical when we actually speak them out.
So yeah, this has to do with the nature of truths in general. So are truths things that only come into existence when we articulate them? So if I say that 2 plus 2 equals 4, so 2 plus 2 equals 4 is a mathematical truth, does that truth only come into existence when I create or write it down as a sentence on a physical page, or if I speak it, and so it becomes a physical sound in the air? I think it's fairly clear to see that things that are truths can be expressed in a physical form. So I can take the proposition 2 plus 2 equals 4, and I can express it in writing. I can express it verbally through physical sound waves. But the expression of a proposition is not the same thing as the proposition itself. And one way to see this is to recognize that the same proposition can be expressed in different physical forms. So take the proposition 2 plus 2 equals 4. You can write that down with Arabic numerals, which is usually how we do it, or you can write it down with Roman numerals. You can write it down in a different way. Obviously, the expression of it is different, but the proposition is the same. Same goes with language. So when we translate something from one language to another, we try and keep the proposition the same, even though we're using different words to express it. So there's a difference between a truth itself and the physical expression of that truth. And the same goes for the laws of logic. The laws of logic are there, whether anyone's thinking about them, whether anyone's speaking them, however we express them.
All right. So, audience, I forgot to tell you beforehand, Dr. Anderson is taking some questions. So if you have any questions that may pop up throughout this interview, go ahead and get them in. And speaking of a question, I think we actually have one. So let me get this over to you real quick. All right. So at the bottom, you'll see this question there, Doctor. This comes from Seth Bloomsburg. And it says, how do you deal with atheists if they say that I don't have to explain the laws of logic to use them? I can use a car without knowing how it works.
I say that's correct. You don't have to explain the laws of logic to use them. And that's certainly not part of the argument that I'm offering. The claim is not that you can't use the laws of logic unless you can explain them or give an account of them, any more than I would say you can't use a car unless you have some sort of qualification in engineering to understand the car. But the question is, what does explain the laws of logic? What accounts for them in the first place? Our argument in the paper is that once you recognize what kind of things the laws of logic are, then you see that there has to be a God to account for them. It's rather like saying, okay, you can't explain, you don't need to be able to explain a car to use it, but there couldn't be a car without a car factory. There couldn't be a car without a car maker. There has to be some explanation for why there is a car in the first place. And that's the kind of argument we're offering here. How do you account for the existence of the laws of logic in the first place? And well, another way to put it would be an atheist can use the laws of logic, but our argument is that they're being implicitly inconsistent when they do, because if atheism is true, if atheism were true, then there would be no laws of logic. So there's what we call a sort of practical inconsistency, that they're using something that their worldview can't account for, and in fact their worldview undermines.
So that obviously the atheistic worldview or naturalist or the naturalistic worldview, materialistic worldview would say that their mind is nothing but chemical reactions, randomly responding, if that makes sense. So they would also argue that there's really no true, I guess, soul. There's no soul. So that would eliminate the idea of, I guess, a rationality of the reality of the things around us, if that makes sense. I'm not sure if that makes sense, but the whole idea. Go ahead, Doctor.
Yeah, I think that's a good kind of argument. It's different from the argument that I'm offering here. I think there is an argument that naturalism or materialism undermines the concept of rationality and undermines our trust in our rational faculties. That's a little different than this argument. But this is basically an argument from the nature of truths or the nature of propositions. But there are sort of similarities between the arguments.
But I think the whole idea of the naturalistic mind, I guess the naturalistic worldview would have to say that real truths are not real. Absolute truths are not real. They reject the notion. They would have to reject the notion that their worldview leads to that logical conclusion.
Well, I would want to make the observation that materialism and atheism are not the same thing. So materialism implies atheism. If you're a materialist, you're going to be an atheist. But strictly speaking, an atheist doesn't have to be a materialist. I think probably today most atheists are materialists, but atheism is just the denial of the existence of God. And actually that doesn't commit you to there being only material things. Maybe there's a realm of Platonic forms or something like that. It's not a popular view, but an atheist could hold that. But if you're a materialist, then I think you've got a particular problem with the laws of logic, because the laws of logic themselves are true propositions, but a proposition isn't a material thing. And so if you're a materialist, you either have to say that the laws of logic don't really exist, in which case, why are we bothered about them? Why do we feel that we're subject to the laws of logic? Why do the laws of logic apply to arguments if they don't really exist, if they're purely fictional entities? So one option for the materialist is just to deny outright that there really are laws of logic. Alternatively, the materialist could try and explain laws of logic in material terms. They could try and say, well, laws of logic are physical inscriptions on a page, or they're neuron firings, they're brain inscriptions, something like that. But we explain in the article why that's not a good option either.
Is it reasonable? Okay, so if an atheist argues that the laws of logic, the laws of logic are created by us, in a sense, our neurological workings, we create the laws of logic, right? So how would you respond to that one?
Well, there are a number of problems with that view, the idea that we create them or bring them into existence. One problem is that, as we've seen, laws of logic are necessary truths, okay? Now, what that means is that they are true in every possible world. And we argue in the paper that if the laws of logic are necessarily truths, then they must necessarily exist. And if something exists necessarily, then it isn't brought into existence. It isn't created by something else. So the problem with saying that the laws of logic are things that we bring into existence with our thoughts or whatever it may be, we ourselves are not necessary beings. Human beings do not exist in every possible world, okay? Human beings are not necessary beings, but the laws of logic do necessarily exist. What that means is there have to be possible worlds in which there are no human beings, but there are laws of logic, which go to show that the laws of logic cannot be dependent on us. They have to exist independently of us. Another problem is that if the laws of logic depend on us, then they could be different. They could be made otherwise. Anything that is a human convention or a human creation can be changed. Well, can we change the laws of logic? Could we make it so that the law of non-contradiction is false, or that we decide to select or create some other set of laws of logic? That doesn't seem to be right either, because, as we've already observed, they are necessary truths. They could not be different than they are. So this is a big problem. If the laws of logic exist, and if they are necessary truths, then they exist necessarily, so they can't depend on contingent beings like humans.
Good response, man. Good response. You're building up my quiver of arrows right now, Dr. James Anderson. Appreciate you, brother. All right. So another argument that is in the article, it says the final argument appeals to the ontological preconditions for property attribution. If you don't mind, go into that a little bit.
Sure. Yeah, it sounds very fancy, but the concept behind it is pretty simple. When we attribute a property to something, then we are implying that that thing exists. So here's a very simple example. The statement, the ball is red. So we have a subject of that sentence, the ball, and we have the what's called the predicate that's ascribed to it, red. Okay, so the ball is red, object and a property that's being ascribed to it. Now, it's a fairly, I think, obvious principle that something can only have a property if it exists. So if the ball is red, then there has to be a ball to have the redness. Once you ascribe a property to something, you're implying that that thing exists. So the ball is red implies that the ball exists. Now think about propositions like the laws of logic. They have a property, namely being true. Some propositions can also have the property of being false, but in the case of the laws of logic, they're truths. So here we have propositions that have the property of being true. So we could say, for example, the law of non-contradiction is true. We're ascribing the property of truth to this law of logic. Well, if the same principle applies, then that presupposes that the law of non-contradiction must exist as well. If the laws of logic are truths, if they have the property of truth, then they have to exist, because something can't be true if it doesn't exist. So that's the argument.
So how would you run away from the fallacy of I think it's Raiification, the fallacy of Raiification? How would you run away from that?
Well, yes, I think we touch on this briefly in the article, but you have to define what that fallacy is. So the fallacy of Raiification is when you make a statement and you assume that the thing exists when it's just an abstract idea. So a sort of classic example of the fallacy of Raiification is to say the average American family has 2.4 children, and someone says, well, where is this family? Where do they live? Okay, well, we're not actually saying that there is this family, the average American family, and they literally have 2.4 children. I don't even know what that would look like. Messy, I assume. But that's an example of fallacy of reification, where you make a statement that the average American family, and are you implying that there is such a thing? Now, the question is, why think that this argument commits that fallacy? Just saying your argument commits the fallacy of reification doesn't explain how it does. And we give a number of arguments, very clear, technically laid out arguments for why we should think that the laws of logic exist. So when we say there are laws of logic, we're not speaking about some abstract reification. We're actually speaking about real propositions, real truths, real things that bear the property of truth. So all that to say, I respond to that objection by saying, well, you define what the fallacy of reification is, and you explain why our argument commits it, because on the face of it, it doesn't.
So obviously we have your article that you co-authored about God is Lord is the Lord of Non-Contradiction. All right, so that's one pillar of the presuppositional argument for God, or that's a part of the tag as well, the transitional argument for God. So we put that to the side. Now we transition to the moral argument. All right, the moral argument. So you see what we're doing. We're sort of transitioning, and we're building up our argument to show that the atheism is intellectual suicide. So we go to the moral argument. The moral argument is also immaterial, and the atheist tries hard to, I guess, reject the idea of objective morals. Though I have ran into atheists that argue for objective morals. They say that there are objective morals. So on the basis of relative morals, objective morals, in what aspect, how would you argue against both? So the relative aspect of morals, I'm sure that seems to be more simplistic, I would think anyway. Then you got the argue from objective morals from the atheistic side. Actually, speaking of Tom Jump, he actually argues that morals are objective, but the way he argues it is that he can account for morals from his own, I guess, quote unquote, he called it naturalistic pantheism, where he creates it and that can account for his morals. So how would you argue for both aspects?
Okay, well, I'm not going to respond to Tom's argument because I haven't encountered it, and I don't want to criticize a position that I'm not familiar with. But sure, so the moral argument, now we're talking about a different kind of argument for the existence of God. And the moral argument, there are actually different versions of it, I'm sure you're aware. But a common one would be that if there are objective moral values, then God exists. There are objective moral values, therefore God exists. So that was a simple summary of the argument. Obviously, it needs a lot more unpacking, but usually it has some sort of conditional claim. If there are objective moral values, then God exists. And then the statement of fact that there are objective moral values, and then it follows that God exists. So if you're an atheist and you don't want to accept the conclusion, you really have to attack one of the premises. And either you're going to attack the premise that the existence of objective moral values implies the existence of God, the conditional premise, if there are moral values, then God exists, or you attack the claim that there are objective moral values. And you and I both know you find both kinds of atheists. So you get those who say, sure, I agree that objective moral values would depend on God, but I don't think there are objective moral values, and I'm a relativist and I'm willing to defend relativism. And then there are others who say, no, I'm going to stick to my guns. I think there are objective moral values, but I don't think you need God to account for them. So how would I respond to both of those? Well, in brief, I think the moral relativist really is denying common sense intuitions about morality. I think that when push comes to shove, very few people are really committed to moral relativism when it comes to moral atrocities like the Holocaust, like child abuse. We could go on and on. In our ordinary lives, we make moral judgments that really take for granted that there are moral values that apply to everyone everywhere. So I'm going to press on whether they are really committed in the way that they live their lives to the idea of moral relativism. And typically, I think you can find that at some point there are some moral values that they're not willing to relativize. The other kind of response would be to argue that objective moral values don't depend on God. So there can be objective moral values, but they don't depend on God. And there are some atheist philosophers who are willing to defend that. Eric Wielenberg is one example. There are some others. And in that case, I'm going to ask, well, what is your account of morality? What is your explanation for how there are objective moral values? And I'm going to criticize it and show that it's not a satisfactory account.
Yeah, I think that like the moral argument is probably one of my favorite arguments, right? It's one of my favorite arguments. I think fundamentally it's easy to grasp. You know what I mean? I think for the layman, somebody, who doesn't have, an academia, that's not in academia or anything like that, I think it's easy for them to grasp. And I think it's a solid argument to show the inconsistencies, as you pointed out, of the atheistic worldview. I had one atheist, just a little bit of experience in my interactions with atheists, that told me that morality is relative. So I asked the question. I said, well, is it wrong for me to beat my dog? I kept it I tried to move the emotional aspect out of it so they could sort of think about it, but I said, is it objectively wrong for me to beat my dog, to hurt my dog? And he said, well, it's all about what makes you feel good or what brings pleasure to you. I said, okay, fair enough. So I get pleasure from beating my dog. Is that okay? He said, no. I said, why is that no? Because it's bringing harm to to the dog. I said, well, it's my pleasure though. I get a kick out of it. I think it's fun. I enjoy it. So I'm going to continue to beat my dog. Well, you're wrong, and I think that's where the inconsistencies. First, they tell me that morals are relative, and there's really no objective standard. So basically, people can just go off whimsically and do what they want to do with no moral accountability. And that's what I would conclude, that there's really no moral accountability because people can do whatever they want to do. How can you call Jeffrey Dahmer wrong for what he did? How can you call Ted Bundy wrong for what he did? It made them feel good. It brought them pleasure. So I would say that's the major inconsistency that the atheistic worldview brings, and intellectual suicide.
Yeah, I mean, my approach is the same when I encounter moral relativists. I remember having a conversation with a work colleague when I was working in a research department in the University of Edinburgh. And he was an atheist, and a very vocal atheist, and critical of my Christian faith. But to his credit, he recognized the implications of atheism, that it would lead to moral relativism at best, that he couldn't be an atheist and consistently hold to objective moral values. At least that was his understanding. So we agreed upon that. And when we had these conversations, he would deny point blank that there are any moral absolutes, that there's any objective moral values. And we kind of reached a stalemate in our conversation. But it wasn't long after that something came up in the news. I don't know if it was like a terrorist attack, or some politician had done something that this colleague thought was reprehensible, and he started going on about how morally bad this thing was, and I had to say to him, look, you're not sounding much like a moral relativist now. Earlier you were wanting to be a moral relativist, but it seems like every time something like this happens that you don't like, you start speaking like a moral absolutist.
Yeah, it's just go from one extreme to another. It's just not consistent. We have another question for you, Doctor. All right, this is coming from Kevin Vasquez. How would you respond to someone who objects? It depends, quote, it depends what type of logic you're talking about, such as fuzzy logic, etc., doesn't it?
Well, if someone said that to me, I would have to say, well, what do you mean by fuzzy logic? Okay, so you can't just throw a term out there and say, well, what about this? Okay, you tell us, what is fuzzy logic? Well, one of the advantages, I think one of the virtues of the argument that we offer in our paper is that it doesn't depend on any particular system of logic. There are there's a system known as classical logic, which includes the law of non-contradiction. In fact, classical logic is basically any system of logic that accepts the law of non-contradiction. So suppose you're talking with someone who says, I don't accept the law of non-contradiction. Well, they must accept some other system of logic, because otherwise you couldn't be having a rational conversation. If someone's going to make an argument for anything at all, even to argue against my argument, they're depending on some system of logic, because argumentation is by definition logical reasoning. So an argument is a good argument if it meets certain standards of logic or if it obeys certain laws of logic. So anyone who's going to engage in argument at all is going to be committed to some laws of logic. Now, we might dispute exactly what those laws of logic are, but they're going to be committed to some laws of logic. And those laws, I think, are going to be necessary truths, in that something has to be a logical law, or rather a logical law has to be a necessary truth. It can't be variant, it can't change, it can't be different than the way it is. So whatever laws of logic they're committed to, at least some of those laws are going to be necessary truths. At least they're going to understand them to be necessary truths. And that's all the argument needs. All the argument needs is that there is one necessary truth. If there's just one necessary truth, one thing that is true that could not have been false, then our argument is up and running. So I take the law of non-contradiction as an example that most people accept, but it doesn't even have to be a law of logic. It could be 1 + 1 = 2. Do you think that's true? Yes. Do you think that it could have been false, that 1 + 1 could have been 3 in some possible world? No. It's a necessary truth. Okay, we got all we need to get the argument started.
Good stuff. Good stuff. So back to the moral argument. So the moral argument shows. So if you could summarize, the moral argument shows that. How does it show that atheism is intellectual suicide?
I'm not sure that it does. I'm not sure that I would make the claim that the moral argument shows that atheism is intellectual suicide. I mean, certainly, I think it puts an atheist in a difficult position insofar as if it is rational to believe that there are objective moral truths, then to deny that, if they're going to take the route of relativism, to deny that is to deny something that seems to be a very, very rational, obvious thing to be the case. So just by denying objective morality, you're already pushing up, I think, against common sense. But this phrase intellectual suicide is a phrase that I used in a talk I gave a number of years ago, and that's probably what you're alluding to when you refer to it. I gave a little lecture a number of years ago entitled The Atheist's Guide to Intellectual Suicide, which was riffing on a book by a philosopher by the name of Alex Rosenberg, who wrote a book, The Atheist's Guide to Reality. And in this book, it's actually a brilliant book, extremely well argued, where he basically makes the case that most atheists aren't consistent atheists. Most atheists don't really follow through on the implications of their atheism. And what he argues, in effect, is that if you're going to be a consistent atheist, you should be a materialist. But if you're a materialist, then not only should you be a moral nihilist, should you deny that there are any objective moral truths, but you should also reject the idea that we have minds that can refer to things. He has this whole chapter arguing that if you're a materialist, then really you shouldn't say there's a mind distinct from the brain. There only is the brain. But brains, strictly speaking, don't think. Brains can't have thoughts because thoughts are not physical things, they're not material things, and brains are just physical material objects. So this is an atheist himself arguing that if you are a consistent, scientifically respectable atheist, then you ought to be a materialist. But if materialism is true, then strictly speaking, there are no such things as minds, there are no such things as thoughts, as intellectual content. And what I pointed out in the lecture is that is intellectual suicide. Because if there are no thoughts, then there can be no thought that atheism is true, in which case there can be no atheists.
Well, that sort of falls into the lap of the laws of logic, then, right? I mean, if you're saying that there's no thoughts there, and so now you're throwing out everything. You're throwing out morals. You're
Yeah.
throwing out morality, because
Yeah.
morality is obviously a heart issue, but it's something that also is processed through the mind. You know what I mean? The heart and the mind are connected. So I would say that's intellectual suicide right there, Dr. Anderson.
Well, yeah. I mean, there's a number of ways you can come at it, but certainly the moment you deny that we have mental lives, which I think is really where Rosenberg ends up. So literally, we have no thoughts, we have no minds, we have no mental lives. In that case, you have no thoughts about morality, you have no thoughts about science, you have no thoughts about logic, you have no thoughts, period. Only if you are a non-materialist can you really countenance the idea that we have thoughts, but thoughts themselves are not physical things. They're the contents of minds. They're not the contents of brains.
What about the argument for uniformity in nature? How do we go about that? The uniformity of nature as it comes to atheism.
Okay, so this is another argument that certainly presuppositionalists have used, and I don't think it's one that's been exclusive to presuppositionalists. I think you can maybe find it among some other apologists who wouldn't necessarily identify as presuppositionalists. But this goes back to a problem that David Hume in particular identified, known as the problem of induction. And it's the question of how is it that we can make inductive inferences from our past experiences to make predictions about future experiences. So if I observe 1,000 swans, and every single swan that I observe in the past is white, then I can make an inductive inference that swans are white. Now, it's a probabilistic inference. It's not absolutely certain. There's always a possibility that you could encounter a black swan or a blue swan or whatever. But if you've observed a lot of things in the past with a certain regularity, then you can extrapolate from that into the future. You can extrapolate from the past to the future. And that's generally speaking how induction works, whether it's done in science or just in our ordinary experience. But what David Hume points out is that inductive inferences themselves make a certain assumption. They have a presupposition of the uniformity of nature. They presuppose that there's a continuity between the past and the future. They presuppose that the future will be like the past. They also presuppose that observations that we make in this part of the universe will also apply to other parts of the universe. In other words, induction presupposes uniformity in time, across time, and uniformity across space as well. And the question is, what justifies that assumption? Is that assumption simply taken on faith? Well, if the assumption is taken on faith, then every inductive inference that depends on it is also a matter of faith as well. But if you have a worldview that can actually account for not only why there's uniformity in nature, but why we know it, or how we can know that there's uniformity in nature, then you have a good account of why inductive inferences works. And so what I've argued in a few places is that if you have a theistic worldview, a specifically biblical theistic worldview, then you have a straightforward account of why the universe is an orderly, uniform place, and why our minds are geared to make these kind of inductive inferences. Whereas if you're an atheist, then you have no explanation. You're certainly going to assume the uniformity of nature. No one can really avoid assuming the uniformity of nature, but you can't account for it. You can't give an explanation for why this assumption is a reasonable one, rather than the assumption that things won't continue the way they are. Why shouldn't we just assume that this is a chaotic universe where we can't make those kind of inductive predictions?
Yeah, and I think once again that laps over to the whole idea of the scientific method. Where you're assuming that as you do if you do a scientific study, you have a hypothesis and you test to see if the hypothesis is true. How can you hold to a scientific method or perform a scientific methodology if you I guess you can do it, but you can't justify it. You can't justify why we see these consistencies across the board.
Yeah, yeah. Certainly, the scientific method. There's a debate, of course, about whether there is such a thing as the scientific method, but certainly a lot of scientific practices take for granted that there is uniformity. So when physicists are trying to discern the nature of certain physical particles, the laws that govern the universe, they are assuming that the experiments that they do at a particular time, in a particular place, are getting at laws that apply everywhere, all of the time. So they're assuming the uniformity of nature, whether they're explicit about it or not.
All right, we have another question for you. When will you and Welty come out with a book-length treatment of the argument for God from Logic and TCR? Have that, haha, that would be neat.
Okay, so this is a great. I'm glad this question was asked because I do need to give credit to the co-author of the article that I've been referring to, the Law of Non-Contradiction. I co-authored that with Greg Welty. Dr. Welty is a professor at Southeastern Baptist Theological Seminary, brilliant Christian philosopher, and also a good friend of mine. And we collaborated on this book. But he has done actually a lot more work, a lot more rigorous work and writing on not so much the argument from logic itself, but a lot of the metaphysics that goes behind it, that basically argues that propositions are divine thoughts. This is, in the question, it referred to TCR. So TCR is theistic conceptual realism, which is the idea that what are often called abstract objects like propositions and possible worlds are actually divine concepts. They're divine thoughts. They exist in the mind of God. And Dr. Welty has defended this claim. Actually, his doctoral thesis was a defense of this position. And so the answer to the question is you need to get on his back because he's the guy who's really qualified to write on this. We plan a follow-up article, at least one follow-up article, because since that, the Lord of Non-Contradiction was published in 2010, there have been some published responses to it, some from other Christian philosophers, some from atheists, some from, I don't know what their position is, but the argument's been criticized. This is normal. You publish an article and then people try and pick it apart. And so we want to take what we think are the most serious objections to it, the most serious criticisms, and give a response to them in a published form. So that's on the books, but I can't give a specific date.
So Kevin, it's coming up, man. You just got to be patient. Patient.
Patience.
It's on its way. So we've talked about presuppositional arguments. We talked about why atheism is intellectual suicide. We've talked about the whole idea of moral arguments, the uniformity of nature, things like that. So my final question for you, Doctor, is what is the gospel truth, as in the biblical gospel truth? What is that?
The gospel truth is that we are sinners before a holy God, and that God sent his Son, the Lord Jesus Christ, to be an atoning sacrifice for our sins, to reconcile us to God, and to rise again in glory so that one day we too might rise and be with God forever. That's the gospel truth, as I understand it.
Amen, man. All right, good stuff, Doctor. I appreciate you, man. Thank you for joining me. And I look forward to other work you're doing. I find you very, very satisfying from the aspect of being easy to follow. And to grasp what you're saying. Sometimes my mind works. Sometimes I can't follow certain individuals. I'm like, I don't get it. But I find the way you come off, the way you're teaching, the way that you articulate yourself, very, very helpful. And there are many individuals out there where I've got messages, they're pretty excited about you coming on, and they also find you very helpful. So I just want to encourage you, Doctor, to keep doing what you do. You are blessing individuals out there with what you're doing in the academic field. And I've also got a message from somebody who's following the gospel truth that they asked me are you going to participate in the debate? And I told them, I don't know. I don't know. I don't know if he is or not. And that's totally up to him, obviously. But I don't know, doctor.
I don't
I
know.
don't know,
I
man.
mean, I'm open to it in principle. Honestly, I don't think I'm particularly good at that sort of thing. I don't think I have the kind of the skill set for public debate. But if the topic were right, if the setup were right, I'll consider it for sure.
I tell you what, my setup is right, man. So you can come on and I can set you up.
I walked into that, didn't I? I walked into that.
You sure did, man. And I can, hey, man, that's what I do, man. I bring debates on here, and I do the debates because I want the body to grow, right? I want the body to be able to stand and give a reasonable, thoughtful response. And I think that's important for the body. I think the apologetic realm is one of those realms that don't get talked about enough in the body, in the church. So that is the reason why I try to plan these debates, get these debates together, because I think they're helpful for the body. And obviously, the gospel is of center, where if we're engaging an atheist or somebody, a Unitarian or oneness or something like that, we want to be able to present the gospel to them through debate. So yeah. I'm gonna keep you in mind,
Well,
doctor. I'm gonna keep you in mind, man.
debates are good as long as they're done well. I figure if it's good enough for the Apostle Paul, it's good enough for the rest of us.
I heard that. I agree with you 100%, doctor. But with that said, man, thank you once again, doctor, for joining me, man. It was great, and I got a lot out of it. Obviously, like I said, told you, my quiver is full of arrows, and I am very, very ready to go out there and, confront these nonsensical arguments, man. So thank you, doctor. I appreciate you very much.
You're welcome. It's been a pleasure.
God bless. All right, folks, that is another episode of The Gospel Truth in the Books. Dr. Anderson, Dr. James Anderson, man. And if you haven't had a chance to check out his conversation with Tom Jump, man, I think you should. Like I said, I find it very satisfying. I found it very easy to follow. He takes his time. He's not rushing through the steps of the argument, right? So I think it's very helpful. And I think you should take time to go check it out. And he also has other content. I think he has, let me bring him back in so I can actually let him know. Hey, doctor, where can we find some of your resources at?
Probably the best place to go is my website. That's sort of a hub for my writings and other things that I've done. It's my personal website. It's www.proginosko.com. So that's PROGINOSKO. But if you Google Analogical Thoughts, that's the name of my blog, Analogical Thoughts. So if you use your favorite web search engine, put in Analogical Thoughts, you'll probably find my website that way.
All right. Cool. All right. I'll see you later, doctor.
See ya.
All right. Yeah, so check him out, folks. He's doing big things, man. He's a blessing to the body, man. And like I said, my first awareness of Dr. Anderson was seeing him interact with Tom Jump, man. And I was like, whoa, I was really blown away. So I had to get him on here. And once again, I thank him for joining me. Like always, I want you guys to go ahead and continue to stay in the loop with the gospel truth, and make sure you hit that subscribe button. Make sure you hit that like button. Don't cut this show off or go on to the next website till you hit that subscribe button. Make sure you also flow over to the iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, Spotify. Hit the like button, hit the subscribe button. Make sure you hit the notification bell. Also on Facebook as well. Stay in the loop because there's a whole bunch of shows. Got shows all the way up to the end of October. So there's a whole bunch of shows coming up. So make sure you stay in the loop there. Before I get out of here, let me go ahead and go over a couple of announcements I have coming up. Oh, didn't want to do that. Not that either. Coming up on May 30th, I have Vocab Malone and Adam Coleman coming on. We'll be discussing Black Hebrew Israelites and their failed theology. That's coming up May 30th at 6 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. After that, I have Tyler Vila. He'll be debating Will Duffy. Does the Bible teach that God knows the future? That's coming up June 5th at 6 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. After that, I have Eli Ayala. If y'all don't know, Dr. James Anderson was actually on Eli Ayala's show, Revealed Apologetics. So go check that out. But in this case, he will be debating Andrew Rogers. Is there evidence for the God of the Bible? That's coming up June 6th at 4 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. After that, I have my first 2-on-2 debate. Cody Sorensen, Merritt Kaiser, Brandon Duke, and Andrew Davis. They're debating, is Jesus the God of the Bible? That's coming up June 9th, 2020 at 6 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. And like I said, that is just the next 4 shows. Stay in the loop. Like, subscribe. Don't forget to do it before you leave. But with that said, I'm going to go ahead and get out of here. And once again, I just want to thank Dr. James Anderson for joining me on this episode of Gospel Truth. Thank you for joining me on this episode of Gospel Truth. And I'll see you Saturday when I'm having a conversation with Vocab and Adam Coleman. All right, till then, may God bless you and may God keep you. Gone.